Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's April 17th, 2019. And today we are super excited to have with us someone that I've wanted to interview for quite a long time. Today we have in the house Bryce Blankenagel. And that is a name that some of you will be familiar with and others won't. Bryce is the host of 3 Mormon-themed podcasts, but the one that's probably most popular and known to those in the know is the Naked Mormonism Podcast. I've known about Naked Mormonism and Bryce for many years. We've been missing each other quite a bit in trying to nail down an interview for Naked Mormonism, and that's 100% my fault. But with no ill intent, it's just I have too many things going on sometimes. So even though I've known about Bryce for quite some time, it wasn't until my brother started really getting into studying Mormon history a few years ago that I sort of got thumped on the head, and my brother said, "Hey, John, what the freak? Why haven't you interviewed Bryce yet?" And I'm like, "I don't know. He's a cool guy." And my brother really enjoyed Bryce's podcast, Naked Mormonism. So that was when I first had kind of a bit more of an in-depth, substantive conversation with Bryce. Joel and I were driving back from St. George area, and we called Bryce on the phone and talked. And Joel and I listened to several of his episodes on the Book of Mormon. And I thought, wow, this is cool, fun stuff. And it definitely inspired me. The episodes that I listened to, I thought they were fun and interesting. And so Bryce and I have been planning to do this interview for a few weeks or months now. So without any further ado, Bryce, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you, John. It's an honor and a pleasure.
All right. So the main topic for today is going to be the Spaulding manuscript theory of the Book of Mormon. Many of you will know that I've been covering truth claims as part of the Mormon Stories Truth Claims Initiative. If you go to mormonstories.org/truth-claims, you can see a series of essays donated to me by an awesome novice amateur historian donor guy who just wanted to see more content on Mormon Stories about truth claims. We've interviewed several episodes or people or scholars on some early Book of Mormon topics, including that massive series with Dan Vogel on the Book of Mormon authorship, and also John Hamer, several episodes. Those are classics already, and they're just from this calendar year. But I strongly recommend you check out those interviews with Dan Vogel and John Hamer, both on folk magic and on Book of Mormon authorship. And, you know, we've talked to Sandra Tanner about the first vision and others, but this episode fits into that series of exploring Mormon truth claims. And, you know, I'll have to sort of begin with the disclaimer as well that, that John Hamer and others, Dan Vogel and Fawn Brody and the Tanners and pretty much any Richard Bushman, any reputable Mormon scholar you know of is not big on the Solomon Spaulding theory.
It's true.
But having said that, that doesn't mean it's not interesting or even worthwhile to talk about. And Bryce was like, "John, we got to talk about Spaulding manuscript." So I'm like, okay, if that's a reason to get Bryce Blankenagel on Mormon Stories, I'll do it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We've got about 2 hours and 45 minutes to do it. But before we dig into the Spaulding manuscript, Bryce and I thought it might be worth taking 15 minutes for Bryce to talk a little bit about his story. His story probably deserves more than 15 minutes, but since this is his first, no, he's shaking his head no. But because it's his first time, we're not going to just like jump in without at least giving Bryce a chance to give us some personal context and to plug his podcasts. Awesome. So Bryce, anything I should have said in the intro?
No, that was perfect. And to be clear, I'm going to do my best to, in our discussion today, to represent the realm of Mormon history and how it views the Spaulding theory as much as possible today. But yeah, I guess I'll just kind of begin it where it all began. I grew up here in Utah, northern Utah, Davis County, of goodly parents, born in the covenant. and, grew up in the church, not, really examining the foundations of it, not really caring more than anything. It was just something that we did, was go to church every Sunday. Went through Eagle Scout, all of the priesthood offices and everything. In teenage years, around 16 or 17, I decided that I just didn't like going to church anymore. And I was very lucky to have an older sister who left the church before I did. And she, I say she probably trailblazed for me. So she had conversations with my parents that I didn't have to have. And my parents realized that if we try and hold on to him, if we try and force him to go to church when he doesn't want to, that's not going to do any good. So my parents were very understanding, and I'm very lucky in that respect. I have amazing parents who are very respectful and who have always respected my decisions, and I'm very grateful to have the parents that I have. So
You didn't feel they chose dogma over relationships with you.
I've never felt that that's the
nice.
case. Yeah.
That's
Like I
nice,
said,
yeah.
I'm very, very lucky.
Yeah.
So around 16, 17, that's when I just kind of stopped going to church. And so I know that probably harms my my ex-Mormon street cred, if you want to call it that, right?
I don't think so.
I didn't get married in the temple, didn't go to BYU, didn't do any of the temple ordinances. I didn't go on a mission. I didn't do a lot of those things. But still, I kind of understand from an intellectual perspective what happens there. And it's one of the main reasons why I like talking to ex-Mormons, because we share so much in common, and I can, poke and prod and explore those topics of what their experiences were like, going through all of those, checking all those boxes that I never checked. So I graduated high school, graduated seminary, and eventually went into the workforce after attending a year at Weber State for computer science. And I was never really interested in church much, or in belief in God and faith in God, anything like that. I was just a fairly apathetic when it came to the question of, does God exist, or, is the church true? Was something that it wasn't a question that ever really bothered me much. Because it wasn't a large part of my life. It had been my entire growing up age. And now that I'm a teenager and, young adult, I'm able to break away. It's like I want to stay as far away from it as I possibly can. So eventually I moved out to Colorado, and I met, I met a world outside of Utah that I didn't know exist. And that world is that the entire world isn't Mormon. Which is a fundamentally weird thing. When you're born and raised here, you think everybody in the world is Mormon. But when you begin living outside of Utah, you're like, oh, wow, it's actually a very, very small minority of people who actually go to this church. And I began having conversations with a friend of mine there about Mormonism, because he was one of the stalwart Christians who had studied up on the history of the church, and, for the sole purpose of debunking Mormonism and showing how it's satanic and everything. And I'm like, man, of course, of course it's Christian. It's Jesus Christ is in the name, right? We've all used that apologetic dodge. So he said, you need to learn some things and then come back and we can have this conversation again. And he gave me a couple of books and resources, and I began learning. And that's when I began tumbling down the rabbit hole of Mormon history. And I have been studying it rapidly now for 5 years. So I'm a baby in the field of Mormon history. And, I quickly learned all of the CES letter stuff, all, First Vision account differences, issues of polygamy, and Book of Abraham, and all of these issues that drag so many people out of the church. And I'm like, wow, I didn't realize what I was in when I was in it. But now examining it through a critical scope, there's just a whole new world of interesting information out there. And, it kind of engendered an interest in comparative religious studies as well, because, Mormonism is one of the best documented early American religions that we have. And it has some of the largest amount of material written about it in comparison to any other Protestant Christian sect coming out of the 19th century America. And the amount of information there is just so incredible and just so fascinating. And, I'm kind of the opinion that you can't truly understand something if you don't know its history. So in order to try and understand Mormonism as much as possible, I sought to understand the history of it. So at this time, early 20s, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, a lot of atheist and skepticism podcasts, science communication podcasts, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and Scathing Atheist, Cognitive Dissonance, so on and so forth. And I said, I got to find a Mormon podcast that just tells the history, just a serialized history, because I need to understand this from its foundation to understand how it got to where it is today. And I looked everywhere. I looked for weeks to find that podcast, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I said, all right, I'm going to make it. And I started it. I started Naked Mormonism. And
Did you listen to Mormon themed podcasts before?
Very few, actually.
Okay.
I had listened to some specific episodes of like Mormon Stories, specific interviews that you had done with Dan Vogel and with John Hamer, and I listened to those. But I never really listened to the entire back catalog. Same with Mormon Expression. But also 5 years ago, there were significantly less Mormon-themed podcasts than there are now. I mean, now there's just this incredible wealth of amazing podcast content out there. But that didn't exist at the time when I began. Also, David Michael, My Book of Mormon, he had started up. He was somewhere in Alma when I decided to start. And I reached out to David and said, hey, I recorded a few podcast episodes. Can you listen to them, give me feedback, and then, I'll decide what I want to do and how I want to approach this. And what it began with was I wanted to read the original 1830 Book of Mormon and compare it to the modern day Book of Mormon and just show the differences. Well, it turns out, you can do that in a few hours. You can talk about all of the differences. You don't have to read the whole thing from top to bottom to point out all the differences because it's a lot of repeat material. And the dude was already reading through the Book of Mormon. But I also recorded some segments on the history of the church. And he's like, well, the Book of Mormon part was boring, but the history, I found that was really interesting. You should do it on that instead. And I said, okay, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds good. So then I recorded a few episodes, aired them. And David invited me on when I was just, I had, I think 3 or 4 episodes out, and he invited me on to My Book of Mormon, and we got together and had a good time reading through a chapter of Alma, I believe it was. And, everything just it all snowballed from there. So eventually he brought me on to My Book of Mormon to read through the Doctrine and Covenants, because if you read through the Doctrine and Covenants and don't know anything about Mormon history, it is god-awful boring. It is an absolute grind. But if you're reading it to understand the history of the early church, it's required reading, in my opinion, to truly understand it. So he brought me on as kind of a Mormon history consultant as he was reading through the Doctrine and Covenants. And then eventually I was covering news headlines that were coming out of the church as well on Naked Mormonism, and that spun off into its own show that I call Glassbox Podcast. So yeah, that's just a very, very brief history and brief rundown. I've attended a lot of Sunstones, a lot of John Whitmer historical associations, and I found the community of Mormon history and Mormon ethnography is just so wonderfully fascinating and very inviting. And, just plugging into those communities has been a very, very enriching endeavor. And I found it to be a fantastic replacement for the community that I experienced when I was actually in the church. And
that's a good background. And I should note that we have had David Michael on Mormon Stories twice.
Yeah.
And that was one of the most fun evenings I've ever had with Mormon Stories. Were you there?
No, I was not there, no, but I watched the video of it, and it was a riot. Absolutely.
We basically, for my second interview with David, I think we interviewed him at Squatter's Pub in downtown Salt Lake City, and we sang hymns while everyone was drinking beer. We were kind of irreverent.
As well it should be.
But he's a great guy, and I was sad to see him move on, but of course I understand.
Well, yeah, he got a promotion at his job. He works in, corporate America, so his free time got soaked up into his new promotion. So he handed it off to my current co-host, Marie Kent, and we've been having a lot of fun, especially because Marie is enjoying Mormon history a lot more than I think David ever did. And she's actually doing research beforehand. And now we're reading through the Community of Christ Revelations because we finished all the Brighamite Doctrine and Covenants. And it's just a lot of fun to learn Mormon history through reading these revelations.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay. Well, thanks for that background.
Yeah.
And maybe tell people a little bit about Naked Mormonism podcast.
Yeah.
I'll say a couple of things that are fun. You go in depth. There is swearing.
Used to be. Yeah.
Oh, you stopped swearing
Well,
in the
well,
in
yeah,
the podcast?
let me talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
So when I started the podcast, Naked Mormonism has been and always will be. This is going to sound selfish to say this, but let me qualify it. Naked Mormonism is and always has been an endeavor for myself to understand Mormon history. And how it began was learning the history that was hidden from me when I was a member of the church. And as I think a lot of people can empathize with, when you leave the church or when you begin learning the history that has been hidden, you become mad. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of frustration. And because you've been lied to your entire life, you paid money to an institution that has systematically lied to you your whole life. And the responses of anger and frustration that we have, those are completely justified. And when people say you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone, it's like, I was taught my entire life to formulate my life around this church. And now I realize that I've been lied to. That doesn't necessarily change when I leave. I'm still interested in the church, and especially when it's an institution that I know that, most of my friends and most of my family are still paying tithing to, they're still going to, and I know that they are being lied to every Sunday when the church is not transparent about its history, about its finances, about its business practices, about its politics. That's a huge issue for me. So yeah, I can't leave the church alone because, well, it doesn't leave my friends and family alone. It didn't leave me alone for the first 2/3 of my life. It's something that had such a dramatic impact on my life. So when I began studying the history, I was mad, and it was very cathartic to get on a microphone and to scream into that microphone and to have, an inbox full of people. Yeah, oh, I was just as mad as you. Oh, I loved what you said. Yeah, Boyd K. Fudge Packer. Ha, ha, ha. Because when Boyd K. Packer died, that was when I was getting started. I danced on his grave. I was so happy to see that old codger go because he was such a horrible, repressive, evil human being, in my opinion. And
interestingly, my brother spent time with him and said he was lovely in person.
I'm sure he is in person,
Right.
but none of us get to know the person of Boyd K. Packer.
Right.
We only get to know the church that he contributed to.
Yeah.
So
And his public statements.
and his public statements, right? The mantle is far greater than the intellect, decrying those scholars who learn Mormon history.
Yeah.
So I was very angry, and that exhibited itself in ranting, in cursing, in possibly distancing people who may be interested in the history, but who may have sensitive ears. And I just viewed that as collateral of getting these feelings out. Eventually I decided, you know what, that is alienating people who otherwise may benefit from this information. So it kind of tapered off, and it has been a clean show now for
A clean show.
well, clean.
No. I'm not saying it's not clean. I'm just saying it's funny to say that swearing makes it dirty. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Yeah. So I have made it
Because the
safe
swearing
for
is fun.
work.
Like my brother, I don't want to disclose too much, but Joel he thought it was fun and funny, and he's not like a big swearer or anything. Like
Right.
it just adds,
It humanizes.
it's good that you make it safe to maximize listenership, but it's also just fun. And you also give nicknames to historical characters.
Right. Well, and that has been very divisive, I've found, actually, because I'll get emails from people who are, interested in the academic side and want to understand it from an academic perspective. And they're like, why are you giving these people nicknames? It's disrespectful. It's childish. It's dumb. But then if I say, okay, John, if I say the names Sidney Rigdon, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, you may have some kind of idea of who they are. If I say the names William Wines Phelps, Ezra Booth, Heber Kimball, Hiram Kimball, if I say those names, it's really hard to understand or associate why they were important in the timeline. So in order to designate them as individuals in order to create a fictional person in the listener's mind that they can see, that they can tangibly see in their mind's eye. It's kind of important to give them a nickname that people say, oh yeah, so when you say that nickname, it invokes everything that you've talked about prior to that point that's associated with that nickname, right? So calling Martin Harris Not So Smarty Marty, suddenly you're like, oh yeah, he was that wild, crazy guy who like walked through the woods and talked to a deer that he thought was Jesus, right? So if you hear that nickname, it invokes an entire body of knowledge about this person that you know, and it really helps to kind of build a structure and a foundation of the history that's easier to understand. Now, of course, historians who are listening to this hear those nicknames and they're like,
it's like, not,
how dare you?
Not So Smarty Marty for Martin Harris.
Yeah.
What are some of the nicknames you?
There's quite a few of them. I have Heber the Creeper Kimball, Bloody Brigham Young. Yeah. I mean, Willie Goat Wilford Woodruff because of his big scruffy beard. They're fun names that are, about their looks or about why they're important. And Bloody Brigham Young, just because of course he was a tyrant, right? So, that's some of the names, but there are quite a few others, and listeners will have to listen to Naked Mormonism to find all of those out. But I've also, I've just found a lot of utility in that. And if you guys do go through the backlog, you'll notice that there's a major shift. Because when I first started learning, I was learning popular Mormon history. But I realized that the popular Mormon history is distilled, potent little arguments that are used as jabs against the truth claims of the church. But that's not where real Mormon history lives. Mormon history is an academic field. And you have to plug into John Whitmer Historical Association, Mormon History Association, Sunstone. You have to come to know the historians and scholars on a first name basis in order to understand the important articles that are coming out, in order to understand the cusp of where Mormon history as an academic field is. That's where the real level of Mormon history exists. And as I was shifting into the Nauvoo era of the podcast, you'll particularly notice that there's a shift away from the popular Mormon history and more into the academic field of Mormon historians. And it's a very subtle shift in the backlog, but you'll kind of notice it catalyze around episode 100 when I had Cheryl Bruno on to talk about Mormonism and Masonry.
I know Cheryl.
Yeah, Cheryl's a fantastic person. She's been extremely friendly and helpful and taking me under her wing in many ways.
She's into polygamy, right?
I don't know much about that.
I mean, history. The history of polygamy.
She has written a few articles on that. Right now, her studies are in Masonry and Mormonism. She took over Nick Latursky's research and is hopefully going to be publishing that seminal historiography of Mormonism and Masonry that all Mormon historians are looking forward to, because there hasn't been a truly definitive work even up to this point. There have been, a few small books and articles, but never a truly definitive work. So, Cheryl, I can't wait to read your book. I've seen a chapter or two of it that she sent over, and it's incredible. But she among a few other historians have really just been very inviting and helping me understand what the realm of Mormon history is and what arguments are persuasive, what historians to pay more attention to, why certain arguments are more important, why certain historians bicker certain ways over certain arguments. And those are just entire fields of knowledge that you need to understand in order to actually navigate the field of Mormon history, because for all intents and purposes, it is a minefield in many ways. But it's interesting. Each mine you step on opens up a whole new rabbit hole that's just fun to dive down.
Well, cool. All right. Well, let's, that's a great intro. I could tell I need to have you on Mormon Stories more, just because you're so articulate and knowledgeable.
Well, thank you.
But let's do the Spaulding manuscript. Now,
okay.
Before we do, I gave my little disclaimer about John Hamer and Dan Vogel and the Tanners and Von Brody and everyone sort of being down on the Spaulding manuscript.
Yeah.
Maybe tell us why we should care about it, even though super smart people that we know about say it's bunk.
Yeah. I think the Spalding theory holds a very interesting utility to us because it illustrates points of Mormon history that are very interesting when we compare it with the believing narrative. And we'll get into why that's important, but you know what? I'm actually just going to start into what I have compiled, the research that I have compiled for this, because I think
Okay.
very soon I'm going to speak exactly to
Okay.
why that is.
Let's do it.
But mostly it's a conspiracy theory,
Right.
right? And anytime, conspiracy theories are tough to deal with.
Right.
So a lot of people don't like them. A lot of people don't like conspiracy theories.
Sure.
But I think there is a certain utility to it. And in order to understand the Spalding theory, you really have to understand a lot of Kirtland era Mormonism. And that explains why the entire theory has been suppressed by church historians, because if you start unraveling, you start looking into, well, who is this guy Philastus Hurlbut? Who's Eber D. Howe? What's this book Mormonism Unveiled? It unwraps an entire field of very dark and interesting and history that is, it reveals the skeletons in the church's historical closet. And the more that they can suppress that, the more that they can keep people from asking those questions, the more they have people not diving into the history. So there's a vested interest to keep the Spalding theory down. But I also think that it's important to understand the way that we do history. And the Spalding theory is a great way to illustrate why history as an academic field is important to us.
I mean, it's also one of the major components of attempting to understand Book of Mormon authorship. So,
Sincerely, yeah, true.
so I think it's really worthwhile to discuss, regardless of the merits.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So let's first.
That's just my endorsement of the topic.
Fair enough. Absolutely. So the Book of Mormon creation narrative as believers go. It's Joseph Smith was visited by God and angels in the 1820s. 1827 received the gold plates written in Reformed Egyptian by Native Americans. And the reason I'm taking so long to say that is because if you're not indoctrinated to believe that that's true, you say that to any outsider, they're like, what? What are you talking about? Gold plates? Are there like repositories of Native American histories written on gold plates anywhere ever? No. Is Reformed Egyptian a real? No, it's not. So it's already, the believing narrative is a baffling concept to most outsiders and most critical thinkers. But then he translated them using the Urim and Thummim. March 1830, the first 3,000 copies of the Book of Mormon were created, or were published. And then April 6th, 1830, the church was founded. Then we have the non-believer narrative, right? The Smith family were destitute, and somehow by hook or crook, they were able to make ends meet. A lot of it was through money digging and magic and occultism. Joseph Smith participated in these groups of folk magic and occultism, as well as the Wild West of the burned over district of Christianity, this Protestant crazy era of religions popping up all over, people declaring that they're prophets. It's a very interesting time in American history. Joseph Smith was attending revivals, and he was watching preachers very closely to see how they operated and, learn from their charisma. And of course, his eyes were bugging out like a cartoon as they passed around the collection plate every time. Joseph Smith attended a few, small stints of formal education, but largely he was completely unlearned. Even though he had very little formal education, he was extremely bright. We know that Joseph Smith was clever. He was, in some ways, very devious, but he was very intelligent, and he was a sponge. He could soak up information quickly. He gleaned knowledge from mentors, Luman Walters, Joseph Knight, Samuel Lawrence, a number of other people. Eventually, he contrived the idea of the Book of Mormon coming forth as a way to convince people that the Native Americans were actually descended from the Israelites and that they were Christians, so on and so forth. Then he hooked, crooked, and he swindled people into a few dozen people believing in what he was saying. Then he authored the Book of Mormon with the help of some scribes. The Book of Mormon was published with a rate of dictation of about 500 plus pages. The 60-day dictation period, John Hamer illustrated beautifully, when you had him on. It could have easily been done with just a few hours work every day. And then the Book of Mormon was born. Mormonism was created, and then Joseph Smith was the first elder, and of course the rest is history. So there's the non-believer narrative and then the believer narrative that we have to compare. So we're basically left to determine the plausibility of these two different versions of early Mormon history. And in this respect, the non-believer narrative is going to win every single time because it doesn't require God. The thing is when a historian is positing that God or divine intervention is somehow an operative feature of their model of history, it's not history, that's theology. It doesn't belong in history because we have yet to demonstrate that A, God exists, B, that God interferes with our lives, C, that God appeared to some random 19th century country bumpkin, and then that God gave Joseph Smith godly powers to translate these Native American plates. So we have yet to demonstrate any of those 4 points. So the non-believing narrative is going to win the historical argument every single time. So with these naturalistic models, Joseph Smith had to have some level of conspiracy in order for the early church to function the way that it did, right? There's the model of Joseph Smith was the only one who knew that this was all a con, and he swindled everybody, all of the witnesses and everybody, including Martin Harris, to sign. Emma included.
Oliver Cowdery.
Yep, Oliver Cowdery, the Whitmers. He swindled everybody. He was the only guy who knew that it was all a con, and he convinced them to sign the statements, and then convinced Martin Harris to fund it, and it was published, and that's fine. That's plausible, absolutely. But then we have the possibility that Joseph Smith conspired with Oliver Cowdery and with David Whitmer, that there was a conspiracy among those three. They somehow swindled the 8 witnesses to sign the statement, and they all swindled Martin Harris, or, those 3 swindled Martin Harris to fund the Book of Mormon. So there's a conspiracy of the 3 of them. Then you also have the possibility that Joseph Smith was conspiring with all 10 witnesses who signed the statement, who held the plates, who saw the characters, the hieroglyphs, and they all helped to swindle Martin Harris to fund the Book of Mormon. And then there's also the possibility that Joseph Smith conspired with somebody else to help him author the Book of Mormon, and they all convinced Martin Harris to fund it. And that's the final conspiracy theory. That
meaning Sidney Rigdon, possibly.
Meaning Sidney Rigdon, exactly.
And then sometimes people want to throw Hiram Smith in there. Some people, because of his exposure to Dartmouth and that sort of thing. And some want to throw Lucy in there, Lucy Smith, Joseph's mom, right?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Those are all plausible, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is like these, we're expanding the level of conspiracy here when it comes to the naturalistic, the non-believer model of early Mormon history. And some level of conspiracy is required. Now it's just a matter of what level of conspiracy we're willing to agree with.
Does a lone gunman count as a conspiracy? I mean, if Joseph was alone,
conspiracy, I guess, requires more than one person.
At least 2.
So if it was just Joseph Smith, then that's not conspiracy.
Right.
But every other possible model requires it,
right,
at some level.
Okay.
And then if at any point,
and I think that's Hamer's point, is that it's just Joseph.
And that's that's entirely possible.
Right,
absolutely.
But a lot of people don't buy that Joseph did it alone. That really Oliver would have never caught on.
Exactly.
That Emma would have never really peeked behind the cloth or cheesecloth or whatever it was.
Yeah. Well, and then we have the Ouroboros of okay, we have the source text. We have the late war as possibly a source text. We have View of the Hebrews as the multiple different source texts. At what point was Joseph Smith sitting there, or was Oliver Cowdery sitting there possibly with one of those books open and just transcribing directly? There's very little actual textual plagiarism that we are able to prove from any of these documents. There are small artifacts from the late war. The Jaredite submarines, they sound a lot like the torpedoes that were conceived of in the late war. Same with the Jesus coming back and the destruction of one of the forts in the late war. There's a lot of linguistic looking plagiarism between the two of them, and a lot of the descriptions of what happened sound very similar. When it comes to View of the Hebrews, there's plagiarism of chapters of Isaiah, just straight taken from it. So if we're talking about Joseph Smith acting as a lone gunman, it becomes kind of hard to explain how Oliver Cowdery was able to buy into this sincerely when he knew that they were plagiarizing other texts, when other texts make their way into the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. So before really getting into Spalding here, a few precursors, right? Conspiracy theories are really tough to deal with. But in my opinion, I think early Mormonism requires some level of conspiracy among the witnesses, among Joseph Smith's earliest followers, among some of the few higher ranking officials in Mormon, elites, as I call them, in Mormonism. And also that not all conspiracies are alike. Not all conspiracy theories are constructed similarly. However, the more people that are required to be looped into a conspiracy theory, the more likely it is to collapse under its own weight, right? So people are really bad at keeping secrets. If they, even if their livelihood and their, public reputation depend on it. So if you have tens, dozens, hundreds of people in on a big conspiracy, somebody's going to spill the beans sooner or later, right? So it's very hard. The bigger a conspiracy theory gets, the less likely it is to be real. So that's a very important thing to understand. And then also another major flaw with Spalding is conspiracy theories are almost impossible to disprove, right? Because you have conspiracy theories that can continually expand, just, loop in more people. You have moving of the goalposts by the conspiracy theorist. And then you also have, when you're trying to debunk a conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorist will vilify you and they'll question the person's motives. Oh, well, you're paid off by the church to try and hide the conspiracy, right? It just becomes an endless cycle of, lack of disprovability and just ever expanding conspiracy theories. So they're really tough to deal with, which is one of the main reasons why I think the Spalding theory is people don't want to talk about it, because it just becomes such a massive and painful and annoying issue to deal with. And a lot of people would think that it doesn't hold any explanatory power. But let's try and discuss that, right? So April of 1830, the church started. This is
okay. Wait, do you want to reveal your bias at the outset? Do you find plausibility, or do you want to wait and reveal that?
Let's discuss that at the end.
Okay.
Well, because if
suspense.
If I say it without any context, people might not listen to the end. They're like, oh, he's a theorist, whatever.
So let you lay out your case.
So let me lay out my case.
And
let me lay out
the
evidence that creates the Spalding theory.
Okay.
And then I'll reveal kind of where I come down on this.
Okay, perfect. I like it.
Okay.
It's a teaser.
Okay, it's a teaser. So here's the blueprint, right? April 1830, the church was started. The first missionaries were called to preach to the Native Americans in Missouri. They passed through Mentor and Kirtland, Ohio, and that's where they converted Sidney Rigdon. This is the historical blueprint for people who may not know kind of the early church history. Then Rigdon traveled.
And again, this is the official version.
The official version,
which the conspiracy theorists question.
Yeah, so this is the official version,
yep.
and then I'm going to give the Spalding theory in a nutshell, and then we're going to go through a bunch of evidence.
All right, got it.
So then after Rigdon had his miraculous conversion, he couldn't put the Book of Mormon down, couldn't, he read it for 3 days or whatever, had his conversion, then he traveled to New York to meet Joseph Smith. And that's where they began working on their Bible revision, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible.
And allegedly, that's the first time they met.
Allegedly. Yeah. According to Joseph Smith, according to Sidney Rigdon, that's the very first time.
And allegedly, Rigdon had no knowledge of the Book of Mormon before those missionaries show up.
He states it very explicitly.
Yep.
Very, very explicitly. And we'll go through that as well. Yeah. Eventually, Joseph Smith gave the revelation commanding all of the New York Mormons to move out to Ohio or Missouri, because that's where they were going to set up their new headquarters. And then Joseph and Emma Smith arrived in February of 1831 in Ohio, and Rigdon and Joseph Smith began running the church as co-presidents. And then as an already successful preacher, Rigdon had a few hundred followers. He converted the majority of his followers to Mormonism, which provided a much needed membership injection in order to allow Mormonism to survive. Had Rigdon not converted, had he not converted his early followers, Mormonism would have just been one of these, rising and dying religions that came out of the burned over district. We wouldn't be talking about it today.
Possibly.
Yeah. And I did a presentation at Seattle Sunstone. I titled it Rigdon, the Forgotten Hero of Mormonism, because without that catalyzing event, Mormonism wouldn't be a thing. So
likely.
It would be different. It would
Sure.
be
Oh, sure.
largely different than we see
No, it was
today.
hugely important. There's no
Yeah,
question.
absolutely. So here's the Spalding theory in a nutshell. Solomon Spaulding was a Revolutionary War vet. He attended Dartmouth Theological College. He even had an overlapping semester with Ethan Smith, author of View of the Hebrews. He attained his preaching license, and he was a minister for 4 to 5 years before he gave it up. He failed in a bunch of business ventures, including an iron forge. Then he turned to writing novels in order to pass the time and to hopefully make money as his physical ailments were taking over and he was unable to physically work. He penned a few books, including The Frogs of Wyndham, which has been lost to history. Then he penned Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek. Now, this is important. He penned Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek. That is an operative manuscript that we're going to be talking about a lot today. And it was written about the Romans being blown off course and discovering America, right? He ended it. It's a terrible manuscript. You can find it online. You can read it yourself. It's been published by both the RLDS and the LDS churches as manuscript found. It ends abruptly. It's about 150 pages. It's not written in the old English style, but you can find a copy of it. You can read it yourself. But then he terminated that project before it was completed, and then he wrote Manuscript Found.
Which is lost.
Which is, ironically, Manuscript Found is lost. Yes. And we'll discuss that quite a bit as well. So the operative piece of the Spaulding theory is that there are 2 different manuscripts.
And just, I know you're going to do this, but describe it, the high-level manuscript found.
Manuscript Found is, well, we're going to discuss the actual witness statements from people who had read it, people who had heard him talk about it. But it is essentially the Book of Mormon. But once again, it's a theoretical manuscript.
Okay.
It has been lost to history, for all we know. So eventually he penned this Manuscript Found, and he left it at the Lambden and Patterson printing press in Pittsburgh, somewhere between 1812 and 1813. And then he ended up dying in 1816.
Okay, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. And I'm going to go through it. Whatever you're about to say. Yeah. We'll get there. So eventually, at this same time, Sidney Rigdon was friends with 2 guys named Ingalls and Lambden with the Lambden Patterson printing press, right? They were printer and clerk for this Lambden Patterson press. Rigdon was a bookworm. He was always known to have a book in his hands. He would stay up late reading by firelight and fall asleep with his head in a book from a very young age. He was also working as a tanner, and he was probably selling book bindings to this printing press in order for them to publish their books. He probably filled his library from their bookstore. That's the best guess anyway. So then in 1823, the Patterson press and bookstore was closed. It was dissolved. They liquidated all of their assets. At some point between 1816 and 1823, Rigdon either stole the manuscript found or he purchased it from the liquidation of the business. It's not known, right? Then in the early 1820s, Rigdon attained his preaching license, and he was mentored by Alexander Campbell, which was one of the preeminent theologians and Bible scholars of the early 1800s. Him and his father were. And Rigdon and Campbell had this massive public debate, and their departure was very sharp. They disagreed about a few points that we find in the Book of Mormon, including communalism, people living with all things in common, and other few points. But then after he departed from Campbellism, he began his own ministry. And he probably had manuscript found, according to the theory, he probably had manuscript found just tucked away in a trunk at this time, maybe working on it in evenings, whatever. Then Rigdon maybe met Joseph Smith during one of his preaching tours, because he was one of the traveling preachers. He had his church and mentor.
During Rigdon's preaching tours.
Rigdon's preaching tours, yeah.
He would have gone to New York.
Pennsylvania, probably. I don't think there has been any documentation found that he ever preached in New York.
Like around 29-ish, you're thinking?
Maybe as early as 22, 23.
Would Joseph been in Pennsylvania in 22, 23?
There's no evidence for it, but the thing is, we don't have GPS tracking for Joseph Smith, right? We know very little about him before he enters the magic and treasure digging.
I just knew for sure he was there around 29. So
he was, I mean, he was living in Pennsylvania in Harmony, which is 150 miles from Ohio.
But you're saying it could have been earlier.
Yeah, but it very well could have been earlier. And the story of him, meeting with the angel in 1823, this kind of was borne out after his church was started. But then the idea, the Spalding theory, claims that Rigdon and Joseph Smith had annual meetings from 1823 to 1827 when Rigdon was working on the manuscript. Annual meetings.
Yeah, that would have been Joseph's cover was meeting the angel every year. Certainly. But in theory, when he was allegedly meeting with the angel, he was meeting with Rigdon.
Exactly.
Annually.
Yeah, and that was just later mythologized after the foundation of the church to throw people off the tracks.
Okay.
Right. Then Joseph Smith acquired the manuscript that Rigdon had been working on for, maybe as long as, a decade at this point. He acquired the manuscript in 1827, and they began working on it, first with Martin Harris, then with Oliver Cowdery and Whitmers and other scribes, Emma Smith included. And then that's when they turned from 1829 or 1828 to 29. That's when they turned the manuscript found into the Book of Mormon that had all of Rigdon's theological underpinnings placed into it, edited into it. Now, one thing that's interesting too is Rigdon was probably prepping his congregations for years prior to the Book of Mormon coming along. There are a few quotes, we're going to read one of them at least, of people claiming that he was prepping his congregations to accept the Book of Mormon once it came along. So it was like he was the John the Baptist character waiting for Joseph Smith to come along with his new Book of Mormon, his new scripture, and then they'd start the church, right? So then they finally, after the church was created, they had the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon began the church as co-presidents, and then they created this story that Rigdon had this miraculous conversion. Parley P. Pratt is also looped into this conspiracy theory. Parley P. Pratt, diverts the missionary troop through Ohio and says, "Hey, let's stop over at my buddy Rigdon's house and give him a copy." Rigdon reads it, and that was all just a ruse, right?
And the idea is that Rigdon would have needed some prophetic character to have produced the book, and that's why he needed Joseph.
Certainly.
Right.
Well, and also people may have known about Spalding and may have known that Rigdon was living in Pittsburgh or, was living nearby somewhere where he would have been able to attain this manuscript. They may have fingered him if his name was on the Book of Mormon. It may have come to light earlier. But if he could use that degree of separation of Joseph Smith, publish it through Joseph Smith, then, hey, he has that degree of separation. He's insulated from it. So that's
the idea
what the theory
and we may cover this, but why Rigdon didn't just claim to be the prophet who produced and translated the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And I think the Spalding theory would say that it was because he didn't want to be pinned with having stolen Spalding's manuscript. Because people were paying attention to Sidney Rigdon. Nobody knew who Joseph Smith was. Right. Rigdon had hundreds of people who had seen him preach. Joseph Smith was a nobody. Nobody knew this guy. Right. So having him be the prophet. And then once Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon team up together, they're basically co-presidents of the church. They're both giving revelations. They're both directing the church. Sidney Rigdon is giving more speeches than Joseph Smith is. Sidney Rigdon is teaching in the School of the Elders. Sidney Rigdon, in many ways, was doing more of the work of actually building the church up than Joseph Smith was. So that's kind of the theory in a nutshell. And I want to do my best to steelman the Spalding theory because...
Did you get that term from Sam Harris and what's his name? Peterson? No.
Jordan B. Peterson?
Yeah.
No,
that's where I first learned that term is from their public debate.
No, I did
You've known that for a long time.
No, I don't pay attention to either of those guys for many, many reasons. No, I got that from my friend Andrew Torres. He does an Opening Arguments podcast.
Tell us what a steel man is, just for those who don't know.
So there's a fallacy known as the straw man fallacy, where when somebody's trying to criticize a person's argument, they present a very weak version of that argument, then seek to knock it down. They present a straw man version of that argument. So I want to try and steel man, create an absolute bulletproof version that somebody who truly, sincerely believes that the Spalding theory is absolutely true would present. Because I think that's the only intellectually honest way to go about this is say, this is the best evidence we have for it. Let's deal with that evidence.
Okay.
So with that in mind, everything that I'm going to say today, it's going to sound like I am a Spalding theory apologist. But at the end of it, we're going to get to where I land on this.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind, everybody. Like, That's the terminology that I'm going to be using, as it's going to sound like I'm a Spalding apologist here. So it didn't take long after Rigdon and Joe teamed up for, astute observers to catch on. It was less than a year after the church was founded that public accusations were made that Rigdon and Joseph Smith were conspiring. This is from an anonymous reporter in the Cleveland Advertiser, February 15th, 1831. The church was founded less than a year before this. It was called the Mormonism or Grand Pugilistic Debate. Quote, Rigdon was formerly a disciple of Campbell's, and who it is said was sent to make out proselytes, but it is probable he thought he should find it more advantageous to operate on his own capital, and therefore wrote, as it is believed, the Book of Mormon, and commenced his pilgrimage in the town of Kirtland, which was represented as one of the extreme points of the Holy Land. End quote. So that's the first reference I can find in any newspaper of somebody accusing Sidney Rigdon of being the author.
That's before Hurlbut.
That's right. Long before Hurlbut came along.
Right.
That's February 1831. Yeah. The church had been around less than a year. Joseph Smith hadn't even landed in Kirtland by February 15th, 1831. He did at the very end of February, I believe. But this first being published in the Cleveland Advertiser, this was a sign of a coming storm, because now the word was out, right? So a Roman reporter in 1831 named James Gordon Bennett published a massive expose on Mormonism later that same year in August and September of 1831.
Because Kirtland, Ohio is starting to swell and people are starting to talk about,
yes,
who is this Joseph Smith guy? What's going on in Kirtland, right?
Yes, exactly. So James Gordon Bennett is actually a really interesting figure in Mormon history, because in 1831, he published this scathing expose about the early church. But by 1843, he had an honorary doctorate from the University of Nauvoo for a law degree, right? I mean, he was a very interesting guy. He founded the New York Herald in 1835. He was the first person to interview a sitting U.S. president. I haven't found that interview, but I know that he was 1836. He interviewed Martin Van Buren. He's just a really fascinating guy. But he published this article in August, September of 1831, titled Mormonism, Religious Fanaticism, Church and State Party. Now, this article was discovered in 1969 by Nancy Richards in a New York library, and then there was a BYU Studies 1970 article by Leonard Arrington that reprints the article in its entirety, and it's typical Arrington apologist. It's a fantastic article. So search for, if you want to read the entire article, it's hilarious. But BYU Studies 1970, Leonard Arrington, about Morning Courier and Enquirer from New York. I'm going to read a few extracts because it's really quite revealing, I think. He starts it out, quote, "You have heard of Mormonism, who has not? Paragraph has followed paragraph in the newspapers recounting the movements, detailing their opinions, and surprising distant readers with the traits of a singularly new religious sect which had its origin in this state. Mormonism is the latest device of roguery, ingenuity, ignorance, and religious excitement combined, and acting on materials prepared by those who ought to know better. It is one of the mental exhalations of Western New York." He gives some sketches of the Smith family that are just scathing, but then he goes on to say, Rigdon. "The individuals who gave birth to this species of fanaticism are very simple personages, and not known until this thrust them into notice. They are the old and young Joe Smiths, Harris, a farmer, Rigdon, a sort of preacher on general religion from Ohio, together with several other persons equally infatuated, cunning, and hypocritic." Scathing article. He continues, "Young Joe, who afterwards figured so largely in the Mormon religion, was at that period a careless, indolent, idle, and shiftless fellow. He hung round the villages and strolled round the taverns without any end or aim, without any positive defect or as little merit in his character. He was a rather stout, able-bodied fellow and might have made a good living in such a country as this, where anyone who is willing to work can soon get on in the world." Now, later on in the article, listeners may have read Obadiah Dogberry's Book of Puki. If that rings a bell, it was published in the Palmyra newspaper by this guy, Abner Cole, who was writing under the pen name of Obadiah Dogberry. And he talks about this magic man from Ohio named Lumen Walters. James Gordon Bennett talks about a preacher from Ohio, but he names Rigdon specifically. It's quite interesting. He says, quote, "After the lapse of some weeks, the expedition was completed, and the famous Ohio man made his appearance among them. This recruit was the most cunning, intelligent, and odd of the whole." Of course, he's talking about this in the context of the money diggers. They heard about this preacher in Ohio who was really good at magic. They wanted to recruit him, so they brought him out to New York. He had been a preacher of almost every religion, a teacher of all sorts of morals. He was perfectly au fait with every species of prejudice, folly, or fanaticism which governs the mass of enthusiasts. In the course of his experience, he had attended all sorts of camp meetings, prayer meetings, anxious meetings, and revival meetings. He knew every turn of the human mind in relation to these matters. He had a superior knowledge of human nature, considerable talent, great plausibility, and knew how to work the passions as exactly as a Cape Cod sailor knows how to work a whale ship. Now, why this is important is because this character sketch of Sidney Rigdon is so incredibly accurate. If you've read Rigdon's writings, if you've read Portrait of Religious Excess, Richard Van Wagner's book on Sidney Rigdon, this amazing biography of Sidney Rigdon, it is a perfect description of this guy. He goes on to say, "His name, I believe, is Henry Rangdon or Ringdon." And then Leonard Arrington editorializes, "Note how precise Bennett is in his reporting," with an exclamation point, or some such word. "About that time this person appeared among them. A splendid excavation was begun in a long narrow hill between Manchester and Palmyra. This hill has since been called by some the Golden Bible Hill." So what that 1831 article is saying explicitly is that this guy, Henry Ringdon or Rangdon, he didn't know his exact name, came over from Ohio before 1830 and helped the treasure diggers excavate this hill in Manchester that is now known as the Hill Cumorah. And I think it's also notable that James Gordon Bennett description of Sidney Rigdon are very accurate, but he doesn't get the name right, which means that he didn't know the name Sidney Rigdon from what other people were telling him about him as a preacher. He knew it from what people in New York were telling him about this Ringdon character, right? Because he went to New York. He interviewed the people who were neighbors of the Smiths in order to gain this information. Couple final points. There is no doubt but the ex-parson from Ohio is the author of the book, which was recently published in Palmyra and passes for the New Bible. They were called translators, speaking of Harris and Joseph Smith, but in fact and in truth, they are believed to be the work of the ex-preacher from Ohio who stood in the background and put forward Joe to father the new Bible and the new faith. After the publication of the Gold Bible, they began to make converts rapidly.
Yeah, that's really early. Like, you know, when I'm reading this stuff in the 60s and 70s where people are remembering back what so-and-so may or may not have said, I'm like, well, that's like 50 years removed or 40 years removed.
And a lot of them are antagonistic.
Like, this is months removed, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's interesting. The other thing is, do we have any reason to believe other than this that Rigdon would have been on those folk magic sort of expeditions? Like in all that reading of Vogel, I don't remember anything insinuating that there's a chance he could have been there. So that's just foreign to my limited reading so far of that early, you know. What do you have any thoughts on that, or other than it's being speculated on here?
So as far as Rigdon being associated with folk magic and occultism
and Joseph's expeditions,
there is no document evidence that has come forward that connects Sidney Rigdon to the Smith family and their treasure digging whatsoever.
Because you'd think all of those estranged treasure diggers would have said, yeah, Rigdon was with us, you know.
You would think.
Yeah.
That's kind of a thinker, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. Which presents one of the flaws is there isn't anything other than late antagonistic sources that explicitly say, I saw Sidney Rigdon with the Smiths.
Okay.
And those are very late. However, this is 1831, August and September 1831, saying There are people around here talking about this Henry Rigdon guy, and he gives us a character sketch of Sidney Rigdon that is fairly accurate from how we understand Sidney Rigdon.
Okay.
So I think it's pretty notable, and it definitely introduces some cognitive dissonance. Like, how do you deal with these two different camps? How do we deal with this lack of documentary evidence, right? So one of the quotes about Sidney Rigdon priming his congregations for the Book of Mormon coming forward actually comes from Adamson Bentley, who was a good friend of Sidney Rigdon before Mormonism. I believe he was even a roommate of Sidney Rigdon. I think they were even related through marriage. So in an 1841 letter, Adamson Bentley said, quote, "I know that Sidney Rigdon told me that there was a book coming out, the manuscript of which had been found engraved on gold plates as much as 2 years before the Mormon Bible made its appearance or had been heard of by me," end quote. That's one of about 5 different quotes of people saying that Sidney Rigdon was preaching about the Book of Mormon before the Book of Mormon made its appearance on the scene. So that's pretty interesting as well. So now let's talk Hurlbut, right? Dr. Philastus Hurlbut.
And just really quickly, as you look at Fawn Brody's criticisms of the Spalding theory, she talks about, recovered memory or implanted memory, or just this idea that people, when they encode and then bring the memory out to working memory and then re-encode it, stories get mixed together. Right. And so the quick explanation of that would be somehow over that 10 years, he mixed whatever he remembered Rigdon saying with whatever stories you heard about Joseph Smith, and then re-encoded them together, and that's sort of implanted memory or tainted memory, right? I mean, that's
near the end of my notes here, I have the weaknesses of the Spalding
got
theory.
it.
I'm going to try and speak to that as best I can.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But the point is that memory is terrible.
Yeah.
If I asked you to repeat one quote that I have read here, one thing that I have said that somebody else said without going back and reviewing the tape, you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So to think that people remembered something from 20 years before accurately, that's pretty tough. Right. So I'm going to try and speak to that a little bit as well. So enter on the scene Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, which best name ever, right? He wasn't even a doctor. His name was Doctor. He was the 7th son of his family, and that was pretty common in folk magic to name the 7th son Doctor. So he joined the church probably in 1832. Before Hurlbut made his first sojourn out of Mormonism, Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith, which Orson Hyde, we know that name. Samuel Smith, he was, a member of the Smith family, one of Joseph's younger brothers. They had been preaching in Conneaut, Ohio, which is about 60 miles away from Kirtland. They were there as missionaries, and while they were preaching from the Book of Mormon, they heard some interesting accusations while they were reading from the Book of Mormon there. Notably, a judge stood up in the crowd and said, "Old come to pass has come to life again," referring to Solomon Spaulding. So Hurlbut heard about these accusations, and he himself went to Conneaut Creek to investigate what was going on there. He returned to Kirtland
as an active believing Mormon, you think?
As a missionary, but I think he was like, what is going, maybe a bit like Ezra Booth, right? So Ezra Booth published his letters after he had joined the church just to find out what was going on. Possibly he heard these accusations after he had joined the church and was like, hey Joseph, can you send me on a mission to over in the northeastern area of the state? I'd like to see what's going on up there. We don't really know, right? So he headed up to Conneaut, and he heard what people were saying about the Book of Mormon. He went there with a Book of Mormon. He read passages from it, and he returned to Kirtland after traveling to Conneaut Creek, and he was excommunicated from the church for unchristian-like conduct with women. That can mean anything, right? That can just be used as a smear because of sexual slander laws. That was just a very broad term that could be used to accuse somebody of doing something. It could have been not even related to any conduct that he was doing with Mormon women. Who knows, right? It was just used as a term to excommunicate him. After he was excommunicated, Hurlbut began a smear campaign against Mormonism and against Joseph Smith. And that's when he got funded.
Just really quickly, I guess in theory, and I'm just making this up, tell me if it's totally off base, if he was investigating the church's truth claims, specifically, the origins of the Book of Mormon and potential involvement of characters that contradicted the official narrative, I guess in theory they could excommunicate him and find any old excuse, including womanizing or whatever. Is that?
Well, grounds for excommunication could mean you made Joseph Smith mad. I mean, seriously, people were excommunicated.
Yeah.
It's not seen, back then it wasn't seen as much of an event as it is today.
Yeah.
It was definitely treated differently. So he began his smear campaign, and that's when he teamed up with some Ohio residents, wealthy Ohio residents, in order to fund his travels, fund this research campaign that he was going on. And this is when Eber Howe enters the scene. Eber Howe was editor of the Painesville Telegraph. He was printing scathing articles about the Mormons. His sister, Harriet Howe, had joined the Mormon sect, and he was not happy about it. So he was very, very antagonistic. They called him the Mormon Eater.
And that's E.D. Howe, right?
E.D. Howe,
Yeah.
Eber D. Howe, yep. So I can't remember. I'm not sure if Eber Howe actually helped fund Hurlbut's research or if he was just saying that I would publish it once he gets it. I'm not sure exactly his role in Hurlbut compiling this research, but he was somewhere in the background there. So Hurlbut spent the majority of spring and summer of 1833 collecting information while Eber D. Howe was compiling research for his forthcoming book, Mormonism Unveiled, which that's the first anti-Mormon book I ever read when I was first studying Mormon history. And it's an amazing book. It truly is amazing.
Can I just say, one of the most brilliant things ever done by the Mormon Church was poison the well for all of us with these, quote, anti-Mormon books.
Anti-Mormon lies.
Yeah, because like forever I just discounted them as, oh, well, we can't look at E.D. Howe's book because he was an anti-Mormon. Yeah. But the truth is, number one, if they were mad, they probably had motive. They probably had reasons, maybe even good reasons. Because who's going to spend time and money traveling the country,
right?
Collecting affidavits?
Why couldn't Hurlbut just leave it alone?
If the church is hurting people and if Joseph Smith is hurting people, then it would make sense that those hurt people would try and stop him.
Yeah,
and what are they going to do if they're hurt by him? They're going to collect affidavits and run around and interview people. And so and again, that stuff is so close to the actual events, right? Like so if we're looking for contemporary evidence, the closest firsthand accounts that we could have, that's what these, that's what E.D. Howe and Hurlbut are doing. They're getting firsthand accounts or accounts closest to the actual happenings.
Right.
So they deserve to be taken actually most seriously, I think, in my view.
Well, I would trust them being antagonistic towards the church. Well, I can't say more, but I would put more weight into what they say about the early church than I would what Joseph Smith said about the early church. Because Joseph Smith had a motive of scrubbing the record of any wrongdoing, of making sure that he presents his public persona as the most holy and pious and revelatory visionary of his day, right? Joseph Smith has a vested interest in seeing this happen. And sure, Eber Howe had a vested interest in writing, anti-Mormon material. And I say anti-Mormon in air quotes every time because it's such an interesting word in and of itself. But Eber D. Howe, he was selling a lot of newspapers that had Mormonism in the headline, right? So he had an interest in publishing about the Mormons, and they were picking up headlines across the nation at this time. But the utility of the term anti-Mormon, like my family today knows that I make my living off of anti-Mormon propaganda. It's an extremely powerful word. It is a mind control word, and it's something that I think more people need to deal with. Because it's very powerful. So Hurlbut went and collected all these affidavits in Conneaut Creek in New York. Family, not family members, but neighbors of the Smiths. He also interviewed a number of family members and close friends of Solomon Spaulding, in addition to neighbors of the Smith family. I already said that. He also found out that the original manuscript story was somewhere available to him. So he approached the widow of Solomon Spaulding, Matilda Davidson, and said, "Hey, can I get this book from you? Can I get Spaulding's manuscript from you?" And she said, "Yes, but it's in a trunk in New York." So Hurlbut had to travel to New York with a letter from Davidson saying that I can access this hair-covered trunk where he found manuscript story and possibly manuscript found. We'll get into that. It's pretty interesting here. Upon Hurlbut's return from New York, return to Kirtland, a physical altercation happened between Joseph Smith and Hurlbut. Hurlbut got arrested by a Mormon constable, and he was issued basically the equivalent of a restraining order by Joseph Smith. So it's interesting to know that there was some bad blood between Hurlbut and Joseph Smith at this time. Also, I should note, after he collected the manuscripts, he passed back through Conneaut on his way to Kirtland, because it's right along the Great Lakes area. He passed back through and he showed the manuscript to a number of people. And we're going to get into some of that as well. But we can't talk about Hurlbut and the affidavits he collected without reading a few of them. So I have just taken a small sampling of what they entail. I would encourage people to read Mormonism Unveiled for themselves. Chapter 19 establishes the Spalding theory and all of these affidavits, or read Naked Truths About Mormonism, an 1888 expose that has a major expansion of all of this, and we'll talk about that soon as well. This is from John Spaulding, Solomon Spaulding's brother. Quote, "He then told me he had been writing a book which he intended to have printed, the avails of which he thought would enable him to pay all his debts. The book was entitled Manuscript Found, of which he read to me many passages. It was an historical romance of the first settlers of America, endeavoring to show that the American Indians are the descendants of the Jews, or the lost tribes. It gave a detailed account of their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea till they arrived in America under the command of Nephi and Lehi." Those names, proper nouns. "They afterwards had quarrels and contentions and separated into two distinct nations, one of which he denominated Nephites and the other Lamanites." He's all talking about the Spalding manuscript found here. "Cruel and bloody wars ensued, in which great multitudes were slain. They buried their dead in large heaps, which caused the mounds so common in this country," which, you had Dan Vogel on to talk about the mound builder myth. The Book of Mormon was created partially to answer the mountain builder myth. "Their arts, sciences, civilization were brought into view in order to account for all the curious antiquities found in various parts of North and South America. I have recently read the Book of Mormon, and to my great surprise, I find nearly the same historical matter, names, etc., as they were in my brother's writings. I well remember that he wrote in the old style, and commenced about every sentence with, 'and it came to pass,' or 'now it came to pass,' the same as in the Book of Mormon, and according to the best of my recollection and belief, it is the same as my brother Solomon wrote, with the exception of the religious matter. By what means it has fallen into the hands of Joseph Smith Jr., I am unable to determine."
So this is what year is Solomon
33.
Spaulding's brother being interviewed?
33. This is one of the
33
Hurlbut affidavits.
Okay, so 3 years after the creation of the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you'd have to explain why the brother within 3 years is totally munging whatever memory he has of his brother's stuff with Joseph Smith, and what would his motive be to completely lie about it?
Right.
With his dead brother.
Yep.
You know?
And we're going to get into that in the strengths and weaknesses portion of it. We also have Martha Spaulding, who was Solomon's sister-in-law. "I was at his house a short time before he left Conneaut. He was then writing a historical novel founded upon the first settlers of America. He represented them as an enlightened and warlike people, white-skinned, enlightened. He had for many years contended that the aborigines of America were descendants of some of the lost tribes of Israel, and this idea he carried out in the book in question. The lapse of time which has intervened prevents my recollection but few of the leading incidents of his writing, but the names of Nephi and Lehi are yet fresh in my memory, as being the principal heroes of this tale. They were officers of the company," so on and so forth. "He gave a particular account of their journey by land and sea till they traveled to America, after which disputes arose between the chiefs, which caused them to separate into different lands, one of which he called the Lamanites, the other he called the Nephites." Another account, she also says, "The old obsolete style and phrases of 'and it came to pass,' etc., are the same as in the Book of Mormon." Here's from John Miller, who was a business associate and who boarded with the Spaldings. "While there, I boarded and lodged with the family of said Spalding for several months. I was introduced to the manuscript of Spalding and perused them as often as I had leisure." So he's living with the Spaldings. He sees Spalding's writings and he flips through them. There's no books in the house that he hasn't read, whatever. "He had written 2 or 3 books or pamphlets on different subjects, but that which more particularly drew my attention was one he called Manuscript Found. From this, he would frequently read some humorous passages to the company present. It purported to be the history of the first settlement in America before discovered by Columbus. He brought them off from Jerusalem under their leaders, detailing their travels by land and water, their manner, customs, laws, wars, etc. He designed it to be a historical novel, and after years it would be believed by many people as much as the history of England. He designed it to be a history book. He soon after failed in business and told me that in order to retire from the din of his creditors, he would finish the book and have it published, which would enable him to pay the debts and support his family. He also talks about Nephi, Lehi, Moroni. I have recently examined the Book of Mormon and find in it the writings of Solomon Spaulding from beginning to end, but mixed up with scripture and other religious matter, which I did not meet with in the manuscript found. So that's John Miller.
So how would he have memories, in one direction, but also memories in the other? In other words, if he's, you're probably going to comment on this later, but that's interesting to me that he could not only remember what was in common with the Spaulding manuscript, but what was left out, right?
Right. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's interesting to me.
Yeah. And this is all right. So we can discuss this a bit more as well. But when we're talking about memory fabrication and your brain subconsciously grabbing onto things and formulating memories around those things, you can remember something in your childhood that never happened. Your parents can remember something in your own childhood that you never remember that did happen, right? Memory is such a fickle and tough thing to deal with. But unfortunately, when it comes to the Spaulding theory, that's all we have is memories from these people. And granted, they're talking about stuff that was going on in 1812, 1811, 1810. This is 1833, 20 years after the fact, right? So that's something we have to contend with as well. One final quote here. This is from Aaron Wright. I read it as most modern history, if it is, talking about the Book of Mormon, if it is not Spaulding's writing, it is the same as he wrote. And if Smith was inspired, I think it was by the same spirit that Spaulding was, which he confessed be the love of money. Right? I can read these affidavits for a long time, but I think you and the listeners really kind of get the idea. They're very consistent among all of these affidavits that Hurlbut collected. A criticism can be leveled that because there is so much consistency,
right?
It's like, oh, well, obviously Hurlbut was guiding their affidavits and, helping them to formulate what they were going to say. But then the argument against that is like, but if they weren't so consistent, you'd say that they aren't accurate. So do you want more consistency or less consistency among multiple unconnected non-family members, or do you want more or less consistency among them? What are you trying to look for in order to say what's more historically reliable?
Right.
Right. So it's kind of this weird world that this lived in. Another guy, Henry Lake, he was a judge. He talked about his wife reading to him the Book of Mormon, and that's when he says she had not read 20 minutes till I was astonished to find the same passages in it that Spaulding had read to me 20 years before from Manuscript Found. And all of them, none of them say Manuscript Story, all of them say Manuscript Found. Every single one of them title it Manuscript Found, right? And I also should note that almost all of them say that "and it came to pass" happens frequently. One of them said that he told Spaulding that "and it came to pass" appears so frequently to render it ridiculous. The passage "came to pass" appears 1,400 times, more than 1,400 times in the Book of Mormon. It was a start of a sentence for that writing style.
How do we know if it was Hurlbut who called it Manuscript Found, or E.D. Howe who called it, I guess Hurlbut, Manuscript Found, in all the depositions he was making, and that's just how he consistently named it versus how they referred to it.
I
don't know. I don't expect you to know.
So
either.
we have, I'm going to read the intro to Manuscript Story here in a minute. Manuscript Story, it's basically the premise of the book, that Spaulding was stumbling around in Conneaut and he found these manuscripts and translated them from the Roman into English, and this is, the Manuscript Story is the autobiography of the author of those manuscripts. So that's the central premise, is that he found the manuscripts are therefore found, therefore he titled it Manuscript Found. And it was just a working title, right? These weren't published. These were just working titles for the manuscripts. Had his editor told him to retitle it, it might not be called Manuscript Found. But Manuscript Found is such an ironic name. It's like, yeah, maybe Hurlbut just fabricated it, right? Yeah, so I get that. So Hurlbut collected all of these affidavits along with a letter from John Spaulding to Matilda Spaulding, Solomon's widow, then living in Massachusetts. That's when he interviewed Matilda Spaulding, got her affidavit, and her affidavit is pretty similar, but it's also a lot more conservative, because the way that I see it is her husband was, at this time, they were so destitute. She was just trying to make ends meet. Her husband was spending all of his time just writing in his den, and she probably wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to what he was doing. Whatever. Before Hurlbut returned to Kirtland, he published in December of 1833 in the Wayne Sentinel, which is the Palmyra local newspaper, that he had accomplished his object in learning the true history of the Book of Mormon. Quote, "The original manuscript of the Book of Mormon was written some 30 years since by a respectable clergyman, now deceased, whose name we are not permitted to give. It was designed to be published as a romance, but the author died soon after it was written, and hence the plan failed. The pretended religious character of the work was superadded by some modern hand believed to be the notorious Rigdon." End quote. So the wording of that doesn't explicitly state that he had a manuscript found, only that he had discovered the origins of the Book of Mormon.
And why didn't he want to name Spaulding?
The way that strikes me, and this is probably presentist in my opinion, the way that strikes me is he was a researcher who didn't want to get scooped. So he was keeping all of his work close to his chest.
Interesting.
And he was like, wait till my expose comes out. I'm going to blow people's minds with this. But I can't tell you, because then somebody will come along and do all my work for me and scoop me, right? That's how it strikes me. I'm sure there's probably alternate interpretations. So then he passed back through Ohio after collecting these manuscripts and showed the manuscripts to the people he had previously interviewed. This is from Mormonism Unveiled, chapter 19, quote, "This old manuscript has been shown to several of the foregoing witnesses who recognize it as Spalding's, he having told them that he had altered his first plan of writing, Manuscript Story, by going further back with dates and writing in the old scriptural style in order that it might appear more ancient. They say Manuscript Story bears no resemblance to the manuscript found." So Mormonism Unveiled is drawing a sharp line between Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek, and Manuscript Found. And that's something we always need to keep in mind.
But it claims to have been, the origin text of the first manuscript claims to be some scroll found somewhere. So again, it deals with the migration that ends up in America. Like, that's interesting, right? And of course,
I'm going to read it really soon.
Okay, yeah,
because it is so fascinating.
Yeah.
The first time I read it, I'm like, well, of course. And I think when I read it to the listeners, I think you'll agree with me. That's like, that can't be real, right? But let's get there first.
I'll steal your thunder.
It's your podcast. Steal as much thunder as you want, man. So there are subsequent affidavits from Aaron Wright and from John Spaulding years later that just validate Mormonism Unveiled's claims. They saw Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek, that Hurlbut had acquired and claimed that it was not manuscript found, that they were so familiar with. So they designated the people who had heard Spaulding read Manuscript Found, who had read it themselves, said Manuscript Story is not manuscript found. They explicitly, multiple times in later accounts, corroborate this detail.
Because Fair wants to basically say it's one manuscript. There was never even such a thing as the second manuscript.
The well.
Right.
And it's very effective.
Right.
It's very, very effective.
Yeah.
Now, this is when we have Hurlbut asking people whether Spaulding's manuscript, it talks about a religious or an idolatrous people. Now, there's some disagreement about how to interpret this, whether religious or idolatrous people. But how I wrap my mind around this is whether the book itself talks about a people being religiously minded or secular minded. And unequivocally, everybody answered that they were an idolatrous people, or they didn't know how to answer it. But of course, I'm sure there are other alternate ways to interpret that. I'm just not sure how else to. And after that, of course, that's when Hurlbut was arrested for his altercation with Joseph Smith. And then because he was arrested, Hurlbut sold all of his work, all of his research to Eber D. Howe for $50 and 400 copies of Mormonism Unveiled. And then Hurlbut basically disappears. And Eber D. Howe gives very, very brief mention to him in Mormonism Unveiled. But there's, basically Hurlbut's name was scrubbed from the entire project of Mormonism Unveiled. And I think that's because there was also bad blood between Eber Howe and Philastus Hurlbut. And I'll get into that as well. So Mormonism Unveiled was published in late 1834, and the impact that Mormonism Unveiled had on the public mind cannot be overstated. Because from that time, publications throughout America ignited with these new revelations in the Spalding theory. Because after 1834, nearly every publication about Mormonism includes something about Sidney Rigdon, about Solomon Spaulding, about a stolen manuscript, or about some kind of conspiracy. Right? Mormonism Unveiled shaped the public mind from 1834 on. And basically every expose of Mormonism that came after that time includes massive chunks from Mormonism Unveiled, or at least pays homage to the Spalding theory. The prevailing theory throughout the entire 19th century was Sidney Rigdon stole manuscript found, he changed it and conspired with Joseph Smith, and then published it. That's what everybody knew about Mormonism in the 19th century, unless they were Mormon, of course.
So in theory, it could have poisoned the well.
Exactly. Mormonism Unveiled in and of itself had a massive impact in shaping the public mind. So we can say that as anti-Mormon propaganda, once again in air quotes, poisoned the well as well.
Right.
But it's also worth noting that Mormonism Unveiled, the affidavits that are included in it by the Smith neighbors, historians cite those all the time as character sketches of the Smith family. For sure. Right? It's just a matter of, because the chapter 19 includes all of the Spalding theory, all the Hurlbut affidavits, that, those just aren't given as much credence because it includes this conspiracy element. Right. And, it's, for every reason that, Spalding theory is kind of viewed as debunked today, those affidavits aren't usually cited or discussed very much. So in the end, at the end of all of this, 23 different people gave 36 separate statements or affidavits claiming that the Book of Mormon came from Solomon Spalding's manuscript from the years 1833 to 1888. 23 people, 36 different statements. And what's important is none of these were retracted. None of these witnesses recanted their statements. And many of these statements were corroborated by later statements. They were not changed, they were not altered, but they corroborated their earlier statements. And that's something that historians like to see. If you have somebody who's making a statement about something that happened in 1815, and they're making the statement in 1833, and then they're making a subsequent statement in 1882, and there's a lot of similarity between those two statements about what was going on in 1812 or 13, that looks really good to historians, right? So I guess maybe to end part one of our discussion, let's do a brief summary, right? So Hurlbut did collect manuscript story Conneaut Creek. Spalding advocates would claim that this was the rough draft, right? And that manuscript found was the final draft of Spalding's book. And that's the draft that Sidney Rigdon stole. Now, and that's not crazy to think, right? So there's the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. This is how books operate. You have multiple drafts as you move forward. So it's not crazy that that manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, was the original draft. Manuscript found was his second and final draft, right?
But that's some major plot changes if you're going to go from a Roman whatever to Nephites,
But the themes are still similar. You're still using...
Right.
You're still using people from the Western world to explain the white-skinned inhabitants of Native America, right?
Sure.
And the extermination of the white-skinned inhabitants who built all of these amazing civilizations and all these mounds.
Yeah.
So the central theme is kind of the same. You're trying to explain the Native Americans and also the disappearing Native Americans, because that was a big question too.
And for me, I'm having to go back to Dartmouth as the potential, source of inspiration, both for, View of the Hebrews and Solomon Spaulding.
But we shouldn't relegate it to just Dartmouth.
Right.
These are
It's
common ideas.
whatever's swimming in the air.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith absorbed all of these.
Right.
Sole authorship advocates say that, these are all things that were very clearly written by people all over at the time. Joseph Smith was just writing. He was one more dude writing one more book in this entire milieu.
And I have to say, one of my favorite episodes of your podcast is where you read off all the different books, like View of the Hebrews and like the Book of Mormon, that were written around the same time.
Yeah.
With crazy coincidences.
Yeah, I think that was
And
probably
I think
the
that's from the
7.5 hour episode on the Book of Mormon or something. Yeah. It's the Book of Mormon is not unique. It's unique, but it's not anything new.
It's predictable.
It's stunningly predictable.
Yeah.
And also very simplistic. It's not literarily profound, or else people who are not Mormon would study it for its literary acumen, but it's not.
Right.
It's just not that complex. It's not that amazing of a book.
Right.
It's just a dude who wrote a book, right? Also, to wrap up, Hurlbut may have also had a first draft of manuscript found with him, in addition to Manuscript Story, Cognac Creek, and we're going to discuss that in part 2 as well. Eber D. Howe continued to hold Manuscript Story, Cognac Creek, that he purchased all the research from Hurlbut while Hurlbut was arrested. He continued to hold Manuscript Story, Cognac Creek in his possession. Then the Painesville Telegraph, his newspaper, burned down in 1836, I think it was, 1837. And then in 1839, a guy named L.L. Rice purchased all of Howe's old work and moved it all to the Sandwich Islands, to Honolulu.
That's why it's also called the Honolulu document or something like that.
Right? It's the Honolulu manuscript, and it's in the Oberlin College now, so it's called the Oberlin manuscript as well. But I call it Manuscript Story, Cognac Creek, for consistency, just to know that that's...
And where's Oberlin?
Ohio.
Ohio, yeah.
So this eventually did, it was eventually found, and I guess we'll call that part 1, because then we open up into the modern Spalding theory after that. So that's kind of the foundation of how it all took shape in the 19th century.